Welcome back to Rainy Days Podcast, number 4. Yes, I can count. It's been a few weeks since we came out with the last one. Both Nikki and I have been busy doing some other creative pursuits, but are happy to be back at it. And this week's episode is with Ann Powers, who is a premier critic who grew up in the Northwest and now is at NPR. But she was formerly with the New York Times pop music critic and has also been a contributor to the LA Times. I know she interviewed Prince a couple of years ago, as well as being an editor for the Village Voice. But the high point, probably, of her writing career would be working at The Rocket in the late 80s and mid 90s. The Rocket was pretty much the premier local music community paper in Seattle in the Northwest. So actually, when Goodness was on the cover, it kind of like was mind-blowing experience. But I think the last time Ann and I, there were years went by. I think we met in mid 80s probably. Oh, that's right. Yeah, her friend Shirley Carlson was the program director at KCMU, which was at the University of Washington and later became KXP, of course. And her friend Shirley had Shadow on to do a new music or audio oasis show, and ended up being kind of a ridiculous, I don't know what you call it, session. I think some people's voices hadn't quite changed in the band at that point. But it was a lot of fun, and I think Ann and I went out to some shows after that and kind of became friends. But there were years went by and I didn't see her, and then I think in like mid 90s, I saw her across the stage. Goodness was opening up for Pearl Jam, and I saw her across the stage, and I was like, Ann? And she was like, Danny? She's like, what are you doing here? I'm like, I'm working. Anyways, it was nice to catch up with her. It was great to talk to her today. And she's also an author, besides writing for all these magazines and papers. She wrote Bohemians Like Us, and her latest book was Good Booty. But one thing I wanted to say before we start this episode is that Nikki Barron and I, Nikki Barron is the editor, both love doing the podcast, and it would really help us out if you could subscribe to our show on the website and on YouTube. So thank you for that. And actually, there may be a little extra music on this episode. We'll have to see if Nikki edited it in or not. So that could be a special treat for y'all. Anyways, cheers. Enjoy. Ann Powers. She's awesome. And take care of yourselves. Bye. Ann, it's a pleasure to have you on here. I haven't talked to you in a long time.
I know.
I think the last time I actually saw you in person was in Missoula in '96.
Yes,
at the Pearl Jam show.
On stage, yeah. We met on stage. Yeah,
right. We opened up for Pearl Jam, and it was super fun at Grizzly Stadiums. And then I was like, wait a minute, there's Ann Powers. That's weird. Yes. And that was back when you were writing for New York Times.
Yes, that's right. I flew out to do that piece, and because I wrote about Pearl Jam again for the LA Times. It was like the first piece I did, big feature I did for the LA Times, which had been 2005 or 2006. But for that, I just came to Seattle. I remember Ed would only meet me in the basement of Easy Street Records. Like I had to go not only into that's the one in West Seattle, right? Not only like into the store, but into the basement. And he was like sitting there at a little table. I'm like, come on, dude.
Yeah, well, him and Matt are pretty close. That's probably like his Reichstag bunker.
Yes, it felt a bit like that, but it was also nice because it was like local color, whatever.
Well, and that's one thing I've been sort of realizing during all this downtime with the pandemic. I mean, I live just across the water in Vashon, and so my Seattle, especially with the bridge went down. I don't know if you knew that, but the West Seattle Bridge is non-functioning.
Yeah.
So the whole community kind of coalesced over there. That's sort of my Seattle these days in a big part. Yeah. Also, because if I go to South Lake Union, I get completely lost and have to resort to my phone because it all looks like, Southern California. It's weird.
I know. It's funny.
No slag on Southern California.
No, hey, there's some great places in Southern California, but That happened a few years ago when I used to come back to visit. I would always, whoever was with me, I'd be like, "Oh, I'll give you the Ann Powers tour of Seattle," and take them by where Scoochie's was or where the doghouse was. Or now I can't even find like the former locations of those places. It's so different than all of my
Right.
landmarks are gone. Even the giant toe is gone. I think. Oh, is the elephant car wash gone? I haven't been back.
They just took the elephant car wash out. I think the only thing that's left is the park for drunks. I
Oh
mean,
my God, that's so crazy. It's
right.
like, I don't know, and I haven't been back to Magnolia since my mom passed away and we sold that house, but I'm sure that's totally different too. But I still believe that the spirit of the city is intact in one way or another. I mean, I'm always interested in whatever sounds are coming out of Seattle, whatever new musical movement is happening. So it's been interesting, Danny, since our time together back in the day, how many cycles of that there have been. But anyway.
Right. When I started doing this podcast, I talked to a good friend of mine who was the radio person for the Fleet Foxes at Sub Pop.
Mm,
And she was like, "Well, why don't you interview, Robin, and why don't you interview Sarah Cahoon?" And there were all these people, and that was the decade that I happened to take off when I had 3 kids and a farm and all that.
right.
That period where you're like, "Whoa, what just happened?"
I
Um,
know.
so yeah, there's these other rings in the Seattle tree that I just have not had time to explore. I've heard some of the music, but haven't had a chance to meet the artists in
Yeah. And
person or
even
talk with them.
even more recently, there's a new generation of like the hardly art bands and all the feminist
Right.
punk bands and Chastity Belt and
Chastity Bell.
all of those bands, Childbirth, and that's just like an amazing scene too. So and of course hip hop and R&B and so much is happening. I was able to stay in touch with that stuff, obviously as a music writer, but also because uh, the pop conference, this annual event that we did, that my husband Eric Weisbard organized for a lot of
I
years.
was reading about that. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike McCready actually did our keynote once. And did he tell you he brought the article I wrote about you guys in the University of Washington paper, and he gave me a copy of it on stage. It was
He
super
gave
cool.
me so many funny pictures. I didn't put half of them that he gave me into the podcast, but
That prom
they're
picture was insane.
yeah, no, the prom picture was super funny, and actually my date got in touch with me and was like, I was really young then. I'm like, I think we all were.
Yeah, that's kind of what prom is all about. But
Yeah, vaguely confused, slightly randy, too many
yeah,
drinks. Yeah,
definitely.
or maybe I have the vaguely confused mixed up with the but yeah, no, I haven't had. I mean, I've gone from rock back sort of more to roots,
Mm,
and a little bit of punk, but my education in hip hop is still lacking. I
yeah,
probably lean more towards learning about reggae than hip hop first, but that's sort of my island thing, probably.
that makes
Um,
sense. That makes sense.
but why don't we talk about writing in the Rocket and
Yeah,
kind of go back, take a little deep dive back. We don't have to stay there, but just for people who don't know,
right.
Ann Powers is a Seattleite and did grow up in the 80s.
I did. I did. And I got my start writing for the Rocket when I was in high school. And
Oh,
I was at Blanchette, and I was writing for the high school newspaper and the Blanchette Miter, it was called. And I would write about the new wave bands of the time, right? So, like, I wrote about the Heaters and the Cowboys and
oh, I
Steve
remember those
Nurse. And,
bands. Yeah.
and this is, you were probably like in grade school.
No, 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 no. I was. I mean, they were the local celebs. I
Right.
mean, the Heaters for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, for sure. And my cousin Greg Powers was in this really crazy band called Fred. And they were a combination of like Captain Beefheart. It was Greg is a trombonist, and he was at University of Washington in the music department, right? And so he and his friend Jeff McGrath, who was a trumpeter, and a bunch of their other friends formed a punk band. So it was like weird kind of classical new music meets Captain Beefheart meets just wild punk, and they were named after Fred Rogers, and they had this crazy lead singer who looked like his name was Kurt Dinky, and he looked like the Dutch boy on Dutch boy paint cans,
Right.
with that haircut. And actually, you can Jeff McGrath just put up a bunch of this Fred stuff online. You can find it at his website, jeffmcgrath.com. Anyway, that was sort of, my cousin was in this band. My boyfriend at the time was a best friend of my cousin, and my best friend, whose name was Nora Carria, and I used to we would do things like performance art type stuff. Like one time I remember we had a tea party on stage while they played, and we were wearing like weird art t-shirts, and everybody had like sideways ponytails. We idolized the B-52s, and we just looked like a bunch of weirdos. And there was another band, oh gosh, Mental Mannequin, and that was Gordon Raphael, and he went on to produce the first album by the Strokes. And
Oh, interesting. I thought that name sounded slightly familiar.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the total obscure. And then the other, and they had a singer named Pony. She was like the most glamorous woman I'd ever seen in my life. And I remember one time going to a show, I think it was the one where we did the tea party, and it was at this weird like veterans hall or something down at the foot of Queen Anne. And Pony and Gordon were dating at the time. And I remember walking into this weird venue, and they're kissing, and they're both in leather leggings, like cool new wave shirts on, and they're kissing, and I'm like, oh my god, that is like the most glamorous rock and roll thing I've ever seen in my life, these beautiful people. So that was my thing. And then there was a band called Mr. Ep and the Calculations.
Mark Arm.
Yeah, that was Mark's band, and Joe Smitty was the singer in that band. That was the loudest band I ever saw when I was.
Now, did you know you were an English major at the UW? Was Mark still going there when you were there?
He was, but he was there. Charles Peterson was there. All those guys were there. I was like not cool enough for them to talk to mostly. I would go to parties and like stand in the kitchen or whatever. They wouldn't talk to me. Later they would talk to me. Charles was nice. Oh no, Tom Price. He was around the U-Men.
Yeah.
And he was the nicest guy. He would always talk to us. Us awkward girls who are standing in the kitchen and feeling.
He's a big he's a good deep thinker, I guess, a big sci-fi fan, and I enjoy talking to him. They just had that U-Man retrospective that Tub Pop put it out.
Yeah. They were a great band. I mean, I think Mr. Ep was like pure noise, so loud, and then U-Men were a little more. There was some like tuneful, garagey element to what they did that I liked a lot. Oh, and I could tell you many other bands from that era. Another that I loved was the Blackouts, and that was Roland Barker was in that band, and then Bill Rieflin, who sadly passed away not too long ago, but he went on to be a really pretty well-known drummer. He played with Ministry and he played with REM.
Right. I knew that. Yeah.
Now Bill, I will just bore you with a story about Bill. So when I moved to San Francisco, when I was 19. And
wow, that's really young.
Yeah, I was very young. And I went there and I didn't know what the hell I was doing really. And I just needed to get out of Seattle, and I wanted to be a poet or something. And I got a job in an Italian restaurant, which I totally bombed because I couldn't carry a plate. And I kept dropping the plates. So then there was Tower Records, and I used to like love the Tower on Mercer Street in Seattle, and hang out there with my friend Nora all the time. And so here's this Tower Records on Columbus and Bay and San Francisco. And I'm like, oh my God, if only I could get a job at Tower Records, I'd be the coolest person in the universe, And I really thought, even though I had already written for the Rocket for like several years, I just thought I cannot be cool enough to work at Tower Records. but I worked up my courage after I got fired from the restaurant, and I walked in, and the person behind the counter was this guy named Miles Boysen. And Miles had been in a band in Seattle called Face Ditch with a guy named Fred Challoner and some other people. And they were like this really out jazz weirdo band. They were good friends with my cousin and the band Fred. And then Miles was there. And then I got the job. And then Bill also worked there, Bill Rieflin from the Blackouts. And so we became friends. And he just was such a lovely guy. And I remember when he joined ministry, going to see him at the I-Beam in San Francisco. And Bill had always been so just a sweetheart and really into esoteric things. We used to talk about like Gurdjieff and Robert Fripp. He'd gone to that Robert Fripp guitar camp thing. And he was like really into esoteric occult stuff. And I was kind of into that stuff too at the time. I was very witchy. And I went to see him at this ministry show. And I remember him leaning down to talk to me from the stage. And he was like smoking a cigarette. And I thought, Bill's been corrupted by Al Jorgensen. He never smoked before. Like, look at him now. He's like a creepy, gross rock star. Anyway, so that was my scene, like pre-grunge kind of, until I met you, Danny, and I met the Shadow Boys, because my friend Shirley and I decided at about age 18 that we were jaded and sick of like art music and punk, and we needed to find like some real rock and roll, and somehow we found you.
Everybody, talking at you because I'm going to start a new subscription thing on my website. It's called the Homestead, and it's been a crazy couple of years, and things have opened up a little bit, and they'll probably open up more next spring for more shows and more communication. But I wanted to find a way to get some of the music out that I've been working on in a way that isn't just broadcasting at people over social media. So I've decided to do a subscription service. It's called the Homestead through my website, Danny Newcomb Music. And if you sign up, you get outtakes, you get songs that are recorded over the past year, as well as some behind the scenes. I'll be working on songs and sharing things like that. I don't know about the farm pics. We'll have to see about that. The animals just won't cooperate. But just wanted to be able to have a conversation, and one that was not dictated by Facebook. So if you're interested in hearing unreleased material or getting unreleased material before it's released, sort of a preview of it all, and some benefits for signing up, you get perks, but you'll find out about those on my website. Anyways, thanks for supporting me. Thanks for listening to my music. And if you're interested, please sign up, support the arts, and stay well.
That's funny. Was it Shirley that found Shadow? I don't.
Well, I don't know how we found you. I can't remember how. I seem to remember going to see you like at a roller rink in Linwood or somewhere or something.
I don't know anything about that.
I don't know.
Do I want to revisit that? I probably do. Yeah, we played up there. I remember we played a couple of shows, and all the Heshers would come out, and it was a big party.
Yeah. Well, you and I went to see Def Leppard together. Do you remember that? We did.
No, was that the Moore Theater?
No, it was actually at the Arena. It was you and me and Rick, I think, was there, and Shirley. Yes, we did that.
That sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah.
Okay.
I loved the hair metal at that time. I mean, Shirley.
Well, Def Leppard at that point in time, they were kind of the apex in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
There were no Poison, but you know.
Yeah, no, not quite. But
so one thing about I want to get back to the Tea Party for a second.
Okay, yeah.
I'm fascinated by this whole sort of. I mean, I talked with Matt Vaughan about this a bunch, the Easy Street owner, but sort of what does it mean, to come up, what's your identity as a Seattleite, Northwest native, and as a Northwest musician. And it used to be, before Seattle was, grungified, really DIY. Like there was nothing here. And so it encouraged you to experiment,
Yes.
if you didn't have, because you weren't going to have access to great studios, you weren't going to have access to, record labels or anything like that. So you kind of had to make up your own scene from the ground up, or make up what you thought was cool, a la Andy Wood, or there's a million examples out there. And the funny thing is that whole thing, which I didn't realize was so cool at the beginning, I got a double dose of because I moved down to Olympia, and it was around the K Records people, Calvin and Nirvana and all that stuff, which was vehemently their own scene, So, so I got a double dose of that whole thing. But is that still true? Is that still true for Northwest artists, or is that kind of?
I think it is. I mean, I think that will always be. Well, it's so hard. I lived in Seattle again from 2001 to 2006. And so I don't feel completely out of touch. I'm not I moved in whenever the hell I moved 100 million years ago. But so I do think I have a sense of it a little bit post Amazon and Microsoft and stuff. I mean, we both have kids who are like teenagers around that age. And I think it's so different for kids now because they're experimenting on the internet more and in every way, including artistically. But I have always found that the Pacific Northwest has been a fruitful place for experimentation and for the avant-garde for a few reasons. One is honestly like the weather, I mean, it's not so brutal that you're driven away, but it's gray enough that you have time to like sit around in some basement with your friends and do strange things, and another is there's this kind of like outsider tradition that runs alongside the working class legacy of the city. And that outsider legacy, I think from the 60s on, it was very much connected to like counterculture and hippiedom. So when punk emerges, it kind of emerges in this way that's like more like glam and even like there was early on in the 70s, I know there were like queer punk bands really, really early on. And then this strange sort of performance arty kind of stuff. And you have like Roscoe Louis Gallery, places like that. Yeah. And like there was another band called Audio Letter, which was Sharon Gannon and Sue Ann Harkey. And they were also dancers who went to Cornish, I think. And so the Cornish scene was part of it too. And just like, as long as I'm dropping names like bombs, Sharon Gannon went on to be one of the two main forces behind Jivamukti Yoga, which when yoga exploded in the late 90s, Jivamukti was like the place. That's where like Madonna went. It was in New York.
Oh, and that was her salon or?
Yeah, that was her yoga studio, and she and her partner David Life, and it was it like defined that whole yoga renaissance.
My wife would probably know about this. I haven't started yet. I probably need to.
You should ask her and Sharon is still around, but she was another one who was like my idol. There were these really interesting women in the scene at that time, in that DIY like avant-garde scene.
That was true for Olympia too. I mean, really? Kathleen Hanna and
oh yeah, of course,
and Slater Kenny and all of that. Yeah, so that was very much part of my scene when I was that age. But I also think there's sort of an egalitarian thing in the Northwest.
Yes.
Both. Yeah. Sex-wise, class-wise, whatever. It's kind of like, if you can do it, show me what you got,
Yes. I mean, the only thing that we have to acknowledge now is it was a pretty white scene, although not entirely, I mean, there were some Black artists in the scene and artists of color. But yeah, that is the one thing I would say. If I loved growing up in Seattle, but if I could have made one choice about my childhood and youth, it would have been to like be in a place of more diversity in that way. But
yeah, it's It's funny. My wife is half Filipino and half German, and for her moving out of Seattle to Vashon, because of the less people of color, it was an issue. But in Seattle, the Asian American community is quite large, and her family's roots go way back within the community.
And we should note, as we're talking about early Seattle bands, Lulu from the Fastbacks is definitely a major star. So,
right,
I mean, she was there, and they were also kind of like role models to me, those women in that band. I mean, they were just way tougher than I would ever be. But
I don't know about that.
Well, in different ways.
Well, it's the gender politics. I mean, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you. I don't want to get too into it because even though I have thoughts, I am a white male, so it's like, well, what can I say?
You can be an ally.
I am an ally. I am an ally. But after years of writing with Carrie and writing for a female singer and supporting and making music with a female artist, a couple of them, I definitely, I've always considered women equal, I guess, in the arts, because to me, the arts, it's not, I don't know. I guess that's just the way I was raised or the way I came up. But, even after being in Shadow and the spandex and the metal, and I never liked them. The metal dudes, they're just 1 degree away from frat guys. They're just, and frat guys grow up, and I'm sure they're lots of nice.
They're frat guys in their women. Their metal dudes are often frat guys in their girlfriend's clothes, like literally. Sometimes. I remember reading that about the Sunset scene, like the Guns N' Roses guys and stuff,
right.
that they would often steal their girlfriend's clothes and wear their girlfriend's clothes on stage, which I thought, give a little credit to them then,
Right, give them the props. My lady picked this up. Isn't it nice?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Anyways, but that's one of the things I've kind of been struck by that may be a little bit different about the Northwest scene in general, as far as gender is concerned. But being in Olympia during the Slater-Kinney years and stuff like that, and also John Goodmanson's a good friend of mine. He produced them and a bunch of other female artists as well. So that's always been part of my wheelhouse. So I'm always a little bit as who I am as a musician, not as a fan. I guess I always feel not taken aback, but always kind of curious, like, oh, where are these issues that are keeping women from performing and writing music more, as a father of a daughter who does play music, but also just as an ally.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, thinking about the Pacific Northwest, in different phases, I think that it has been a very open place for women artists. During the 90s, there were some challenges. I think the aesthetic of grunge, and I know I'm using the G word, the bad word, but Olympia was kind of like the sister city to Seattle in many ways. Like, let's take that term literally, right? I mean, that's where Riot Grrrl happened, but Riot Grrrl happened, as you know, since you were there, partly in response to what felt exclusionary about rock in general, and not necessarily Seattle, but like all rock, But I think Evergreen, as I understand it, there was a lot of opportunity to study feminist ideologies, and
I spent so many hours in seminar on other people's identity issues, which is great. I mean, I definitely feel like I've been to boot camp.
Right.
And in a respectful way. I mean,
No, and I mean that happened for me at University of Washington. I mean, I took a women's studies class at my freshman year. I went to UW for like a year and a half, and then I went down to San Francisco. But I remember that women's studies class like really blew my mind, and it also threw a lot of stuff into relief for me about rock and roll. Because back in the day, this is in the 80s, right? So it's like there was a lot of anti-rock and roll feeling among some feminists, and I had to work that out for myself. Like, how can I love the Rolling Stones?
How can you love Mick Jagger? I know that was my next question.
Yeah. And I had to kind of work that
Who
out.
did not play Brown Sugar in
Yes.
Texas, right?
Or in Tennessee. They played here the other night. I didn't go see them because I'm being COVID cautious, but they didn't play it here either. But, you know, I think that's something that's really foundational to my work is trying to always think about why do I feel so connected and freed by rock and roll, this form that, you know, doesn't exactly have a lot of space for me. It has space for me in a certain way, but not in other ways. I mean, there's always resistance. And I think, even, you know, within the 90s rock world, there's much more consciousness about that than any other era. And we can talk about how punk set the scene for that, indie music set the scene for that. And by the time we get to Pearl Jam, for example, those guys are very conscientious about it. Also interesting at that time was all the work that was being done on pro-choice activism. And, you know, they were involved. I mean, a lot of the bands were involved with that. And I, you know, I remember some friends of mine put out a compilation record. I can't remember what the name of it was. That was like raising money for NARAL or something. And there was just like, that was like the cause, you know. Oh, and something else to turn the subject to a somewhat, you know, harder thing to talk about. But I think Mia Zapata, her life and her death made a big difference in the Seattle scene as far as thinking about these issues and thinking about the safety of women in the scene. You know, it had such a huge impact that very few people outside of the Pacific Northwest really were that aware of, because it happened fairly close to Kurt's death. So it was kind of overlooked, you know.
Yeah, although the repercussions in many ways, I think, have been stronger and more long lasting.
Yes, I completely agree.
Everybody, talking at you because I'm going to start a new subscription thing on my website. It's called the Homestead, and it's been a crazy couple of years, and things have opened up a little bit, and they'll probably open up more next spring for more shows and more communication. But I wanted to find a way to get some of the music out that I've been working on in a way that isn't just broadcasting at people over social media. So I've decided to do a subscription service. It's called the Homestead through my website, Danny Newcomb Music. And if you sign up, you get outtakes, you get songs that I recorded over the past year, as well as some behind the scenes. I'll be working on songs and sharing things like that. I don't know about the farm pics. We'll have to see about that. The animals just won't cooperate. But just wanted to be able to have a conversation, and one that was not dictated by Facebook. So if you're interested in hearing unreleased material or getting unreleased material before it's released, sort of a preview of it all, and some benefits for signing up, you get perks, but you'll find out about those on my website. Anyways, thanks for supporting me. Thanks for listening to my music. And if you're interested, please sign up, support the arts, and stay well.
Were your parents were your parents writers too, or what did they do?
Oh gosh, no. My dad was an accountant at Boeing, and my mom was a homemaker. So no. I mean, no, not at all. I don't even know how it was just something I always did. And then, I mean, I always liked to write. But then in high school, honestly, and I've said this many times, I fell in love with music, but I wasn't going to be a musician. I didn't, you know, I played classical guitar as a child or whatever, and I'd like to sing, but I didn't have, you know, that drive. And so I wanted to figure out a way, like, how can I be in the scene? Like, what can I do to not just be like a a girl hanging out,
Right.
and that's kind of why I started writing. Like I wanted to meet boys in bands, meet
Well,
girls in bands.
and it turns out when it's well done, it's extremely powerful art form of its own.
Well, thank you. That's very kind.
Yeah.
Genius.
So I wanted to talk to you. I mean, we've been talking about the Northwest and many things Northwestern, but I wanted to hear a little bit about Nashville.
Oh yeah.
And your take on it, because I'm a big fan of a lot of the music, that's been percolating out of there, and have gotten to be a bigger fan of Americana music in general.
Well, you have to come down to the Americana Fest. Hopefully next year. Americana Fest just took place, and it did actually happen in person.
Oh wow.
COVID is still pretty bad here. You might have heard we have some like complicated issues here in Tennessee, and politically it's been a struggle to master the pandemic. But I will say, I mean, I moved to the South because my husband Eric got a job at University of Alabama in 2009, and we were living in LA, and I was at the LA Times. That was amazing. I mean, I fulfilled many dreams, including the ultimate dream of my life, which was interviewing Prince, which I got to do then. but and I loved LA, but he got a job in Alabama. So off we go to Alabama. We lived there for 6 years, and Tuscaloosa wasn't for me. I needed to be in a music town. So I had started coming up to Nashville to do events at Americana Fest. And I was like, what is this magical place? Because, it is a music city more than, it's like Seattle. It's so much like Seattle in many ways.
Okay.
But it even looks physically kind of like Seattle. Like we live in this kind of combination. It's a brick house that looks on the outside like kind of like a Tudor, and on the inside it's like a Craftsman. I mean, it's just that it just looks, with the yards, and it looks a lot of the neighborhoods look like
a Seattle neighborhood. Yeah.
It was built in the same era. Like a lot of Nashville architecture dates from around the turn of the 20th century. So I immediately felt connected there. But most of all, I felt connected to the fact that it is a musician's town. It is a working musician's town.
Right.
And much like Seattle, the communities are very tight and long-standing. People work with each other for decades. And then also my other favorite city in America, which is New Orleans, I think they are the only two cities where you can truly be a middle-class musician, and you don't necessarily have to have other jobs, because in New Orleans, it's all based on the tourist economy and playing live, which is increasingly true here too, for better and worse. In Nashville, though, it's studio work. There's so much studio work, and so many people make records here that you don't even know. It's not just the country scene. It's like every kind of music. And you could be a songwriter, you can be a studio musician, you can be an engineer, you can play have a Thursday night gig in a restaurant or in a bar or something. There's so many ways to make a living. When I moved here, 2015, that was just like a moment when that felt really, really true. And it was sort of like Seattle was when I moved back there in 2001. That good feeling, things are growing. There's a lot of excitement. And it's not gone too far. Now, what I fear right now is like it's gotten much more expensive here in Nashville. Guess what? Amazon came here, and Oracle is coming here, and that side of it's taking over. And also the tourist industry has gotten a lot bigger here. You might have heard about the bachelorette parties.
Yeah, those like cattle cars that drive up and down.
Yeah, the transportainment. So that part of it's not so great. But what I found was that there were all these working musicians who were oh my God, Danny, it's insane. Like you could go to, I don't know, like my local Cafe Rose, my local like bistro on a Tuesday night. And maybe somebody's a little combo's playing. And then afterwards you find out that guy who's on the drums or that woman who's on the bass, made 6 records with Winona Judd or something. I mean, this is like
Right.
literally when we moved here, our dishwasher broke, and the guy who fixed our dishwasher had been on a couple of George Jones records. I
See,
mean,
Seattle doesn't have that kind of studio infrastructure.
no,
And
it
it's
doesn't.
always been been a lot of the DIY stuff.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I wish it did have more of that now. Although the music business has changed so much, and there's so much less revenue in general from
Right.
making recordings that it's
Yes.
strange.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I wish it had that blue collar, middle class musician. I don't know, group of families, because now it doesn't feel like that. Seattle feels very tech to me,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
well, it's when real estate prices, when an average family home gets over 800,000 is the median.
Right.
I mean, I bought my first house for $165 off an artist in 1997.
Right. Right.
So,
No, I know. And that's happening here in Nashville, which is what's scary. Like, I
right.
mean, not to get into too much real estate porn or whatever, but our house has appreciated a couple $100,000, in
A
less
few
than
years.
in like 5 or 6 years. Yeah. And
Right.
it's not because we've done a lot of work on it, but I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see how Nashville evolves. We do have a challenge because Tennessee is not a progressive state in terms of the
Yeah.
state government, and there
But
is
that's
tension.
gotta change, doesn't it? I mean,
Say again.
it's got to change at some point. The demographics are changing, right? I mean,
well, the South is the South. The South is what the South is.
Yeah. I mean, sometime if I come down there for Americana Fest, we're gonna have to have a drink, and you're gonna have to tell me about the South, because that's still like this thing. I'm just like
yeah. It's. I mean, I never thought I'd live in the South. I never thought I'd not live on a coast.
Yeah.
And I do miss the coast a lot, but I found a lot of beauty here and a lot of powerful people. I always say I love my Southern freaks because they've had to work harder than any other freaks I've ever known. And there's a lot of power in that resistance,
Right.
and that,
Right.
and I
And
think
knowing
you are
yourself
seeing
that
that.
well.
Yeah, and you're seeing that emerge now. With someone like, say, Adia Victoria. I don't know if you've heard her new record.
I haven't heard her. I've heard of her for sure. Jason Isbell played on a record, right?
Yeah,
Did he?
yes.
Yeah.
And T-Bone was part of it, T-Bone
Nice.
Burnett. But she's someone I've known since I moved here, and I've watched her evolve and really become this powerful force. But she has went through a lot, as often like the only Black woman in certain scenes, but now she's like really found community here and just become this incredible force. And that is what I love. That is what I love.
Right.
I have some other artists to mention, like that Erin Ray, who is a great vocalist, beautiful vocalist and songwriter. She has a new record coming out produced by Jonathan Wilson that she made out in LA. But she played on my porch when I first moved here for a little thing for NPR. And now she's really become this beautiful artist. Gosh, who else? Well, obviously Jason and Amanda. There's so many. Kelsey Walden, who is she's one of the signings to Oh Boy Records that is John Prine's label.
Right.
John's son, Jody, and wife Fiona are still running that label. It's just a wonderful home to artists. There's also a great guy from the West Coast, Trey Burt, who just put a record out on Oh Boy. Those are a couple of my favorite Nashville records of late. So it just like it keeps evolving, and it's so great to see these artists.
It gives me heart. Yeah, it gives me a lot of heart. I mean, because I think the kind of rock and roll we grew up with, the hair metal, the grunge. I mean, everybody, a lot of people died who were in the grunge movement. Being able to play music and evolve with a craft that has some traditional, maybe rules or form, but can evolve too, is that sounds great. That sounds like a great place to live.
That makes me want to tell the story of the first music I saw after, in that tiny moment when it felt like the pandemic was almost over, hot back summer, as we call it. I went with so it was my friend's birthday, and we decided we would take a chance and go see some outdoor music. And we went down to our local American Legion, which is just down the block from where I live in Inglewood, East Nashville. And they have Honky Tonk Tuesdays. If you've ever heard of a podcast called Cocaine and Rhinestones that Tyler Manco does, it's a great country music podcast, but he was one of the founders of this Honky Tonk Tuesdays thing. And so the Legion was having music outside, and it was Chris Scruggs, who is an heir to the Scruggs legacy of country music, and is an incredible singer. And Kenny Vaughan was on guitar, one of the best guitar players I've ever seen. He played with Lucinda. He's played with like tons of people. He and Chris both play with Marty Stewart in the Fabulous Superlatives, which is an amazing band. And they're just doing like old country songs. And it is, I mean, this is the kind of music you would pay, $100 to see or something in a great venue, but it's just in the parking lot. And that's really what Nashville is. That's the magic of Nashville, is to see these artists that are just going to play in your local backyard, but they're incredible. So.
Yeah. No, that idea of community. Do you know Ian Moore?
Yeah. The name I know. I don't know if I've ever met him in person, but of course I know who he is.
Yeah, he lives on the island. He's from Texas, and he's pretty much a rock star in Texas still. But he talks a lot about that because he comes from the Texas blues background.
Oh yeah, and Austin is very similar. If he was in Austin, I mean,
right? Yes, he was from Austin, but he talks a lot about, and he's talked to me. He's been kind of, will talk to me about. He moved up here 10, 14 years ago, I guess, maybe 16 now. But he talks a lot about how sort of this conflict between the new and the traditional.
Yes.
And whereas he can play the music he's playing till he's 85.
Right. Yes.
But then starts talking about the Seattle music and he starts asking me questions like, well, why does it always have to be a new band on KXP? Why are they always doing new?
That's
and
interesting.
I'm like, I don't know, man.
There's a lot of ways to think about that. I mean, I think.
Right. I mean, there's X too, right? You could go back to that. There's a total deconstruction of all these different, elements, right?
No, totally. I mean, I think, new technologies give birth to new music. So, if you're thinking about like hyper pop, I was having a conversation today with a colleague of mine who's 22, and, they're really into hyper pop, which is like completely synthetic music where there's like pitch shifting all the vocals, and it's like, but that's something for them that really resonates as a non-binary person. It's very much about evolving identities and all this. So that is generationally perfect, for people who are in their early 20s, and maybe some people who are older too. But so I want there to always be a space for the new, but I also this is something I think about a lot. Like, I want music to be a sustainable lifestyle for all of us. And I want, and it horrifies me how musicians are put in this position of it's a feast or famine. Either you're like LeBron and you're a total rock star, you're making gabillions of dollars, or you're not making any money right now. And I am hoping and seeing some examples of, kind of alternative systems and trying to be more sustainable. And I think communities like you're talking about sometimes can generate that kind of sustainability through loyal fandom and the willingness of the community to support musicians. At least that's a hope I have. It's even if it's just like, Tuesday night, every Tuesday night, the Fats Kaplan group plays down at the 5 spot and people come out and they, pass the bucket and they make a little money that way. But it's hard. It's really tough because musicians are not honored in our society. I interviewed Judy Collins a couple years ago for this project I'm working on. And she said, I asked her, in the 60s, like, was it hard for women? She said, well, there were a lot of guys and it was, probably harder for women. But she said, I just think it was hard for all musicians because musicians are treated like children in our society. They're indulged and they're also given no power. And that is she said, that is the greatest sin of the music industry, is to infantilize musicians. And that really resonated. Like, how do you be a working musician? That's like one of the major questions of our time.
That's a badass quote. I like that.
Yeah.
That's great. It's Yeah, I didn't grow up with musical parents, really super academic parents. And I didn't really, it was never brought up as a viable way to be,
Right.
I did it anyways, but it would be nice if there was more of a place, and not just music, for the arts in general.
Yes.
I think that's something that you see, like in Canada or Australia or places like that. They have government programs and things like that. And of course, the real travesty is that America is such a wealth of great music.
No, I know. Well, who knows, Danny? Maybe when we've all, when climate change puts us all in strange little localized environments where we're all living in tree houses or something, we'll come back to some kind of communal music making and supporting musicians. I don't know.
Well, the Northwest hippie in me really likes that idea, Ann, so thanks. Yeah. Well, it's been such a treat talking to you. Thank you for taking the time. It's nice to catch up.
It was super fun. Thanks so much.
Dark horse, you never seem to care what anyone tells you, but oh, I can't help feeling you're strange when you say we're just animals in a wilderness. You explain.
You're listening to a sneak peek of Feelings by Danny Newcomb featuring Carrie Akri. Subscribe to the Homestead at DannyNewcombMusic.com to hear the full song now.